Among the groups opposed to Issue 1 is the American Civil Liberties Union of Ohio. I talked with policy counsel Patrick Higgins. The argument against Issue 1 says, quote, you can't put a price on public safety. Issue 1 is dangerous. But isn't it reasonable to consider public safety in determining if someone can be released?
Yes, and that's exactly right. So public safety is considered when we're talking about bail. I think there's a distinction that folks are less aware about around Ohio, and that's why we're getting the word out, is that bail has two components. One is a determination of conditions of release, and there's a second component, which is cash bail, which is commonly considered, among folks to be one and the same with bail. And so courts can and do consider public safety when determining whether or not a person can be released at all. They do have the discretion, along with prosecutors, to request what's called a preventative detention hearing, which can deny a person bail altogether, meaning they don't get out if the court or the prosecutor believes a person is so dangerous they can't go back to their communities. What's incorrect and what has been kind of the status quo and what folks have been relying on is setting cash bail in an amount that's so high a person could never hope to obtain it. We think that's unjust and unfair because it limits who gets to go home based upon the size of their bank account.
The argument for Issue 1 says that, and that's on the other side, of course, the Ohio Supreme Court found that public safety could not be consideration with respect to the financial conditions of bail and that only the risk of non-appearance could be considered. Is that true?
Yes, that is true. And so what the decision said from the Supreme Court of Ohio in DuBose v. McGuffey was what we think is a clear and plain reading of Criminal Rule 46 and the Constitution, which is that the purpose of cash bail, setting an amount that a person can pay to buy their freedom, is to make sure that person comes back for their court date. It's not to punish them, it's not to keep them detained, it's to put an amount of money on the line to make sure that person comes back for their court date. Any amount that goes beyond that, according to the Supreme Court, is excessive and therefore unconstitutional.
So are you arguing that this issue will just lead to bails that are really high for people who can't afford them, but can be afforded by people with higher incomes?
I think that's certainly a possible outcome, is that when we're considering public safety, or courts are required to consider public safety when setting cash bail amounts, it doesn't really get to that end of what's going to make sure this person comes back to court. I think it falls back on, again, that failed status quo of, is this a correct mechanism for keeping people locked up? And I think certainly that's a possible outcome. And so people who can't afford that cash bail amount are going to sit in jail regardless of what, kind of risk they pose to this public.
You're on the same side on this as the conservative Buckeye Institute. Why is that, and how is that even?
So I think, what unites opposition to Issue 1 is a belief that, everyone deserves public safety. Everyone deserves to live in a safe community. But we also agree upon a liberty interest pretrial. We're talking about people who are legally innocent, not yet convicted of a crime, and whose lives fall apart after 1, 2, 3 days when they're sitting in jail. They can't, during that time, usually have the same access to an attorney to prepare a defense as a person who's out pretrial. They can't go back to work. They can't pick their kids up from school. And we recognize that there's some liberty interest in a person going home before their trial date, and that there's a large amount of people sitting in our jails who are there simply because they can't afford their cash bail amount.
Tens of thousands, as I recall. There have been discussions about moving away from cash bail before this issue was proposed. There are a lot of people who are, again, not convicted of a crime who are there in jail because they can't afford the bail. The question is is it in good public safety measures to keep them there?
Yes, that's certainly right. So House Bill 315 is currently sitting in House Criminal Justice Committee. Its companion, Senate Bill 182 in the Senate Judiciary Committee. Those have been there since May of 2021. And what they propose is a system that bases who gets to go home based upon, presumption that a person goes home, considering public safety if the prosecutor or judge wants to do so, and leaning against or leaning away from our reliance on a cash bail system. And we support that because we know that there's thousands of people on any given day that are sitting in Ohio jails pre-trial. So again, not convicted of a crime, could be returning to their communities, their work, their families. And we think that's important because we think it adds stability to their lives, to their communities, and informs a broader picture of public safety as a whole.
The amendment would take power away from the Ohio Supreme Court and put it back in the hands of local judges. With all that's been happening with redistricting, which the ACLU has been involved in, going before the Ohio Supreme Court, with the balance of power on the court potentially to be decided in this election, where justices are running for the first time with party affiliations on the ballot in the November election, isn't this a good thing to move power away from the Ohio Supreme Court and put it back in the hands of local judges who know what local public safety is?
So we're opposed to issue one. We think that's a bad step for a number of reasons, but primarily because what underlied the foundation to the DuBose decision was practice wasn't fair across county to county, and we know that across all 88 counties there are different practices, different judges. And we think having a consistent rule set by the Supreme Court of Ohio that honors that presumption of innocence, that makes it fair, dependent on a person's ability to pay, is the right system to follow, rather than putting this where the outcome could be vastly different based upon whether you're being prosecuted in Hamilton County, Meigs, Van Wert, whatever it's going to be. We think it's important to have a more informed process and continue on like the path that DuBose v. McGuffey set us on.
Last year, the Ohio Supreme Court had pushed forward a uniform bail schedule for counties that had multiple courts in them, and really cash bail, non-cash bail was considered to be a first option there. Does this affect what counties? Will this affect what counties are already doing?
I think that's a good question. So I think some folks will say yes, that the DuBose v. McGuffey decision is influencing what they're doing, especially when it comes to bond schedules. Beyond that, issue one doesn't say anything about bond schedules. So I think to be determined. I think that's going to be, we'll see different outcomes, different courts, depending on who's advocating. I think beyond that, in the alternative that we're advocating for in House Bill 315, doesn't say anything about the use of bond schedules. So, courts who want to continue using them can do so. We're not personally at the ACLU of Ohio going to advocate for the use of bond schedules. We think there are better ways to make sure a person comes back to court. But I think remains to be seen.
Does this issue, if it passes, derail any other attempts like you're talking about in the legislature that would deal with this issue? This would set, because it's in the Constitution, would set all those aside.
Correct. So I don't think, if issue one passes in November, it doesn't stop House Bill 315 in its tracks. I think the two, at least from my vantage point, can coexist in the world, but we don't want to see issue one because we know that cash bail isn't what keeps us safe. It's been a failed status quo in the past. We're not less safe now, as some folks might argue, but we are proposing in House Bill 315 a better system that we know is data informed and will keep the public safe in a way that nothing that's happening right now will.
Both Republican Governor Mike DeWine and Democratic candidate Nan Whaley say that they are voting yes on issue one. Does that hurt your efforts to try to oppose it?
I think certainly it's not helpful to see two folks, supporting this measure that, we've had a broad coalition in the State House, like you already mentioned, conservatives, progressives, folks in the middle, faith communities, all types of folks, including directly impacted families who have been through this system over and over again, saying this is not the way to go with reliance on cash bail. And I think it's unfortunate that we're seeing folks come out and support it and not really looking at the broad coalition of folks who are saying this is not the right idea and we have a better way and we just have to opt for it now.
I don't know if you can answer this, but there's been criticism of the timing of this issue and issue two on the ballot this year, in a year that was expected to be good for Republicans. Are you concerned about the timing of this issue now with, as you said, bills that are already in the legislature?
Yeah, certainly I'd rather not see issue one on the ballot in November. It's something that I think it's unfortunate that with all the momentum and progress that we have actual bail reform working our way in the legislature. I don't think issue one is bail reform whatsoever, because I think reform means we're improving something, and it's not improving our bail system. So I think it's unfortunate if folks would see issue one, if it were to pass, to say we've accomplished bail reform, because that's simply not the case. And so I think, to that extent, don't love to see it. But I think if anything, it would be, at least in my mind, reinforcing the idea that we need actual bail reform and we need House Bill 315.